Recently, I uploaded a video to my YouTube channel, and the subject of the video was me turning a compost heap. And I think the video lasted for maybe 8-9 minutes, maybe 7. About that duration, this film. And a few days after uploading this video, someone left a comment on it. And they said, in this comment, they said, "Oh, what's the whole point of this film?" Or words to that effect. "It could have been done in 30 seconds. And I thought to myself, I says, what a belittling comment that is. You know, my films, when I make my films, they're intended to be entertaining and to bring some joy and some thrill sometimes, and entertainment to people's lives. People around the world, and I'm not going to exaggerate here. I admit there are people on YouTube who have higher viewing figures than I have for my videos. But there are many people around the world, and not just in this country, not just in England. People around the world who watch my videos, and my films bring a sense of joy to their lives. You know, what I'm trying to say here is there's an entertainment value in a film rather than just making a point. You know, the point of that video in many ways was to demonstrate to people about the process of making compost. But there was another point in that film, and that was to provide an entertaining value to people. Rather like it's funny, it reminds me years ago. When I was 16, I bought a CB radio. My Uncle Alf, who I used to hang around with a lot in those days, he just bought a CB radio, and if he bought something, I had to have it as well. So I got this CB radio. I got this CB radio, right? And my Uncle Alf had a mate who was also on CB radio. And this guy was called Arthur. His CB handle was Wizard. Anyway, this Arthur, in those days, I think he was 50. When I was 16, he was about 50, I think. Anyway, and he was known as the 50-year-old virgin. Yeah, so he probably was 50, wasn't he? Right. He was a bit of a spooky character, were Arthur. He lived in a little town called Ravensthorpe, which is near Dewsbury, a few miles from Huddersfield. And I always remember going to see my Uncle Alf once, and my Uncle Alf told me that Arthur had been round again. And he told him about Arthur had had a trip to Huddersfield to buy some handcuffs from this shop. There's a gun shop. There's a gunsmith in Huddersfield on Lord Street. And Arthur he'd been to Huddersfield a few times to look at these handcuffs in window. And on this particular occasion, he'd gone to Huddersfield specifically to buy a pair of these handcuffs. And I always remember my Uncle Alf telling me that Arthur had been to buy these handcuffs, and he was describing, he gave him an account of his trip to Huddersfield. And he said that the account that Arthur gave actually took longer than the trip itself. I always remember that. And in many ways, I admit that sometimes some of my films are a little bit like that. Maybe even this one, because the whole point of this film is I've come here to the Mermaid Fish and Chip shop in Morley to buy some traditionally cooked fish and chips. I'm rather hungry. I've already had my breakfast today, and it's nearly 8 o'clock. And I only had a little bit of breakfast as well because I didn't have any crumpets or bread into toast. So usually for my breakfast, Usually for my breakfast, I always have a red grapefruit and then a yoghurt, bit of cheese on a cracker, and some toast, usually with peanut butter on, or maybe Marmite. I quite like Marmite. Peanut butter, blackberry jelly. Now there's a whole other film to make about blackberry jelly, because it's one of the favourite things I do like in life is blackberry jelly, but only by a certain brand. I'll talk about that in another film, because I'm getting a bit peckish. I'm here at the can you see it? The Mermaid fish and chip shop in Morley. It's funny, years ago I used to live in Manchester, and I used to know this bouncer who worked on the door of a club called Napoleon's. I think he was called Mark. Nice lad. Nice lad. Anyway, he was from Manchester, had quite a Mancunian accent, the way he talked. And we used to have a natter. Thought he was a nice lad, so I used to have a natter with him. Not every time I saw him. Sometimes I'd just say hello and then go in, but usually I would have a bit of a natter with Mark, 'cause he was a nice lad. Anyway, he always told me, I told him, he says to me one day, probably not long after we met really, the first time we met, he says to me, he says, whereabouts are you from? And I told him, I says, I'm from Batley originally. I says, I've been about a bit, I says, but I was born and brought up in Batley. Oh aye, he says, a mate of mine, he says, I used to know a lad from, Eckmanwyke, and Eckmanwyke is a town next to Batley. And he says, a while ago, me and my mate, we wanted to go for some fish and chips. And my mate said, oh, let's not bother over here in Manchester getting fish and chips. He says, I'll take you for some fish and chips. And they drove for about an hour to go to Eckmanwyke to get fish and chips. And this Mark, this bouncer, he had to say it. He says, we drove all that way. He says, we drove for a chuffing hour in car. He says, but they were the best fish and chips I've ever tasted. And if there is a point to this film, apart from its entertainment value, it is that it is very, very true. You know, I've been around the block a few times. I've been around the block a few times, me, but I must say this. You know, I've been to some places. But the thing is, you've never tasted fish and chips until you come to Batley, Dewsbury, Morley, Eckmanwyke. They really are the best fish and chips you'll ever taste. Anyway, best go and get them because I'm fucking starving. So many thanks for watching, and I shall see you soon. Cheers now.